There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a military range right before something extraordinary happens. I've been around long enough to recognize it. It's not peaceful, it's the silence of the world holding its breath. Like the air itself knows something is about to change and it wants to pay attention. That's the silence I remember from that October morning in the Nevada high desert. The kind of morning where the sky is so blue it almost looks fake, and the cold air bites at your ears but you don't really notice because your whole body is tuned into something else entirely. I was there as a civilian contractor, survey and logistics, not military, never was, but I'd spent the better part of 12 years working alongside these people, and I knew their world well enough to read the room, to read a range, to read the energy of a group of soldiers who had already made up their minds about something before the first shot was even fired. And what they had made up their minds about on that particular morning was Sergeant Elena Vasquez. Let me back up. The program was called Archer 7. It was an experimental long-range precision trial, the kind the Army runs every few years when they want to push the limits of what's technically possible and also what their shooters are capable of. Not a competition exactly, but not a competition either. You know how the military is. Everything is a test. Everyone is always being evaluated. The trick is pretending you don't know that while also being very aware that you do. Archer 7 was pulling together 6 shooters from across different branches and specializations. The idea was to see who could push the furthest, not just in terms of distance, but consistency, adaptability, environmental reading, all of it. Long-range shooting is never just about the trigger pull. Anyone will tell you that. It's math, it's whether it's patience, it's the ability to hold yourself completely still inside while the world outside is moving. The program coordinator was a man named Colonel Davis Hargrove. 15 years into tour, a chest full of commendations that he wore with the practiced ease of someone who'd forgotten they were there. He was the kind of officer who was genuinely respected by the people under him, mostly because he was competent and fair, but he had blind spots. Most people do. His blind spots, as I would come to understand that week, were very specifically shaped like a 26-year-old woman from San Antonio, Texas. Elena Vasquez had arrived the previous evening, right around sundown. I'd been near the equipment bay when her truck pulled in, and I'll be honest, I didn't think much of her at first either. Not in a dismissive way, just in a this is a lot of people arriving way. She was medium height, dark-haired, wearing dusty civilian clothes because she'd driven in from a separate assignment. She had a rifle case that she carried herself, wouldn't let the logistics guys touch it, which I noticed but didn't think too hard about. She checked in quiet, didn't introduce herself around, found her bunk, got her briefing packet, went to eat alone. I found out later that 3 of the other 5 shooters had already heard her name and were quietly confident she'd wash out by day 2. I also found out that the one shooter who hadn't formed an opinion was the only one who'd actually looked up her record before arriving. His name was Corporal James Whitfield, and he kept his thoughts entirely to himself, which in retrospect was the smartest thing anyone did that whole week. Day 1 was orientation and equipment check. Colonel Hargrove ran it himself, walking the group through the range setup, the target configurations, the environmental monitoring stations they had posted at intervals across the valley. The range itself was something to see, a long corridor of desert scrubland carved between 2 ridgelines, with targets positioned at incremental distances starting at 800 meters and extending theoretically to over 3,000. The furthest target positions were more landmark than practical. Nobody was expected to hit them, they were there to define the limit of the possible. That morning felt routine. The 6 shooters stood in a loose row while Hargrove went through protocols. There was a man named Becker from the Marine Corps, big, quiet, extraordinarily capable, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from actually being good at things. There was a woman named Tran from the Air Force, compact and precise in the way she carried herself. There was a sergeant from the Rangers named Okafor who was the tallest person I'd seen in a while and who had hands that seemed almost too large for the delicate work of fine-tuned shooting, though I learned quickly that appearance lies about these things. And there was Elena. Hargrove was explaining the Barrett M82 configurations available for the extended-range portions of the trial when he reached the equipment table and stopped. He looked down, he looked back up, he looked at the group. "Whose kit is this?" he said. There was a pause. Elena raised her hand, not sheepishly, just factually, the way you raise your hand when someone asks if you ordered the coffee. Hargrove looked at her rifle case, then at her, then back at the case. "Sergeant Vasquez." "Yes, sir." "This is your personal weapon." "Yes, sir." He didn't say anything for a moment. The other shooters were carefully not looking at each other. I was standing about 20 feet back, and even from there I could feel the temperature of the moment. What Hargrove was looking at was a Barrett MRAD in .338 Lapua Magnum, a precision rifle that, in the right hands, is one of the most accurate long-range platforms on the planet. But it was the modifications that were catching his attention. The chassis had been custom-fitted. The trigger group was clearly aftermarket. The scope, a Nightforce ATACR that probably cost more than most people's cars, was mounted with a level of care that suggested someone had spent a lot of personal time thinking about this particular relationship between their eye and their target. Hargrove set the case back down. He looked at Alina for a moment with an expression I couldn't fully read from where I was standing, but I caught the edge of it. It was the expression of someone who has already decided what they're seeing and they're deciding it doesn't fit. "That's a personal setup," he said. "Yes, sir. We have program issue Barretts for the extended distance phases." "I know, sir. I'd prefer to use my own rifle for the qualifying distances, if that's acceptable." The pause that followed was about 3 seconds. It felt longer. "We'll see how qualification goes," he said and moved on. That evening, I was eating at one of the long tables in the mess tent when Becker sat down across from me. We'd crossed paths before on a different program 2 years back and had a comfortable enough acquaintance to talk honestly. "What do you make of Vasquez?" I asked him. He chewed his food for a moment. "She's quiet." "Yeah. Quiet can be good or bad. What's your read?" He shrugged, not dismissively, just genuinely. "I looked her up when the roster came out. Her record's clean, good scores at Bragg, nothing that makes you sit up but nothing that makes you worry either." He paused. "That rifle, though." "What about it?" "That's not a rifle someone carries around because they think it looks nice. That rifle has been somewhere." I thought about that for a while after he went back to his food. There was something in what he'd said that stuck with me. The rifle had been somewhere. The rifle had a history. And the woman carrying it had decided that history was worth dragging across a desert to a proving ground where she was already the underdog in everyone's mental ledger. That night I couldn't quite sleep. The desert gets cold fast once the sun drops, and I lay in my bunk listening to the wind move across the range and thinking about what the next few days were going to look like. About Alina Vasquez eating alone. About the way she'd raised her hand when Hargrove called her out, not defensive, not apologetic, just present. Just, "I'm here and this is mine." Day 2 was qualification. 800 meters to 1200 meters, standard configuration, prone unsupported. This is where programs like Archer 7 separate the serious from the very serious. The distances sound dramatic to civilians. A kilometer is a long way to the naked eye. But for anyone who spent real time on a long-range precision course, 800 meters is where you're just getting warmed up. It's the distance where you find out who has fundamentals and who has been faking fundamentals. Alina shot third in the rotation. I positioned myself where I could see both the shooter and the spotting scope readout. It's a habit I'd developed. I like to see the whole picture when I'm watching something unfold. She took her time setting up, not slow, deliberate. There's a difference. Slow is hesitation. Deliberate is knowing exactly what you're doing and doing each part of it completely. She checked wind with a small anemometer, checked it again, looked at the flags at 3 positions downrange. She adjusted her position once, twice, settled. The rifle went to her shoulder like it belonged there, like it had always belonged there. The first shot broke clean. I heard the distant clang of the target indicator a beat later. Sound travels slow at range. Dead center. 800 meters dead center, first round cold bore. The spotter beside me, an army tech named Garza who I'd worked with before, marked the hit and said nothing, just made his notation. The second shot, 950, dead center. 1100, she adjusted for something. Wind had shifted, maybe 2 miles per hour, nothing dramatic but enough to matter at that distance. She held for a moment longer than her previous shots. The round went, target indicator, dead center. I looked over at Garza. He was staring at his scope. He made his notation. "Clean?" I asked him. "Clean," he said. His voice was very neutral, the way voices get when people are trying not to show that they're surprised. She finished the qualification phase with a score that tied Becker for the top of the group and edged out Tran by a fraction. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have made someone watching casually say anything other than, "Oh, solid group." But I was watching carefully and I could see the shape of what she was doing. She wasn't showing anyone anything. She was establishing a floor. She was saying, "This is the minimum of what I can do." Hargrove reviewed the scores that afternoon. He was professional about it, acknowledged the qualification results across the board, noted the top performers, laid out the structure for the extended range phases beginning the next morning. When he mentioned Vasquez by name, it was in the same tone he used for everyone else. But I caught something at the edge of his expression when he looked at the numbers on his tablet. A small recalibration, a tiny adjustment to whatever internal model he'd been running. He didn't say anything about it, but it was there. That evening, Alina was at the far end of the mess tent again, eating alone, writing something in a small notebook. I thought about going to talk to her and then didn't. Partly because I didn't want to intrude on whatever she was doing in that quiet space, and partly because I had the sense, not rational, just instinctive, that she didn't need anything from the world right now. That she was already inside something, some private calculation or preparation, and the best thing the world could do was stay out of it until she was ready. Whitfield was the one who finally went and sat down near her. Not directly across, he took the seat kitty corner, gave her the option to ignore him. I watched from a distance. She looked up, he said something. She said something back. He showed her something on his phone, I couldn't see what. She looked at it for a moment, then looked back at her food, then said something that made him nod slowly. He came back to the main part of the tent a few minutes later and sat down near Becker and me. "She's something," he said quietly. "What did you talk about?" Becker asked. Whitfield thought about it for a moment. Wind. The night before the extended range phase, I stepped outside around midnight because I couldn't sleep. The desert was dead quiet, that particular silence that only exists when you're genuinely far from everything, when the nearest highway is 20 miles away, and the sky is so full of stars it looks like someone spilled something up there. I walked toward the range perimeter fence just to move, just to think, and there was Alina. She was standing at the fence looking out across the dark range toward the target line. She had her hands in her jacket pockets. She wasn't doing anything in particular, just looking. I almost turned back, but she'd heard me coming and looked over, and there was nothing awkward in her expression, so I walked up to where she was standing. "Can't sleep," I said. "Thinking," she said. I stood next to her for a moment. The range stretched out ahead of us, invisible in the darkness except for the faint reflections of the distant target frames catching starlight. "How far do you actually think you can push it?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. The wind came through between us, cold and dry, and she turned her face into it slightly the way people do without thinking. "Far enough," she said. I didn't ask what that meant. I had a feeling I was going to find out. Morning on the high desert comes in stages. First there's this thin gray light that doesn't feel like dawn yet. It feels more like the night is tired and sitting down. Then a line of color appears along the eastern ridge, orange fatting into pink, and the whole landscape goes from dark shapes to real shapes, edges resolving out of shadow. Then the sun actually lifts, and the temperature drops another 2 degrees before it starts climbing, and suddenly you're standing in what feels like a different world than the one you woke up in. Day 3 of Archer 7 began like that. I was up before the briefing, walking to the operations tent with a cup of coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long and tasted like it knew that. The range crew was already out, checking equipment, verifying the target positions. I could see flashlights moving in the distance like fireflies. The extended range phase was starting at 1,500 meters today and was designed to escalate. Each shooter would progress through defined distance increments, dropping out when they failed to maintain acceptable groupings at a given range. It was a structured elimination, not cruel about it, just honest. Some ranges are beyond some shooters. The point wasn't to humiliate anyone. The point was to find out where the ceiling was. Everyone's ceiling was different. That's what these programs exist to understand. The 6 shooters assembled at 700. Hargrove ran through the day's protocol with the kind of efficiency that comes from having run these briefings 100 times. He covered wind conditions, a steady 7 miles per hour from the northwest at the time, likely to shift through the morning, temperature, humidity, altitude. He talked about the equipment available. He noted that shooters could use either program-issue rifles or their own approved platforms. He glanced at Alina when he said that last part, not pointedly, just a glance. She was looking at her notebook. The order of shooting had been randomized the night before. Alina drew the 4th slot. Becker went first. He was shooting an M82A1 from the program issue table, and he did what Becker always did, moved with absolute economy, made everything look slightly easy, put rounds into targets with the reliable precision of a man who had been doing this long enough that most of the drama had been processed out of it. 1,500 meters, solid groupings. 1,800, still solid. 2,100, one hit went slightly high but still within acceptable parameters. He stepped back, no expression, just performance. Tran went second. Her style was different from Becker's, more visible adjustment, more interaction with her spotter, a communication approach that some people mistake for uncertainty but is actually the opposite. Tran was always talking through what she was seeing and doing because she processed information out loud. She knew exactly what she was doing. She managed 2100 cleanly and pushed to 24, where one round opened up the grouping enough to flag. Akaffer was third. He was the surprise of the morning. The big sergeant from the Rangers turned out to have a stillness in him on the rifle that his body didn't advertise. He went quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet when he was prone and shooting. He made it to 2100 before 2 rounds in sequence told him the wind was getting ahead of him, and he stepped back without complaint and made a note in his own logbook with the expression of a man cataloging information for future use. Then it was Alina. I want to try to describe what it looked like from where I was standing, which was about 40 feet behind and slightly to the left of the firing line, near one of the monitoring stations. I had a clear line of sight to the shooter position and to Garza at the spotting scope. Alina laid out her equipment without rush. The rifle came out of its case and she assembled the configuration she was going to run. She made one small adjustment to the scope mounting I hadn't seen her make before. A half-turn of something I couldn't identify from my distance. She settled into her position. She took 3 breaths. She checked her data card, which I could see was covered in small handwritten notations, not the printed range cards the program provided, but something she'd made herself in her own system. She shot the 1500-meter target and hit it, which at this point was simply what everyone had done. I caught Hargrove making a notation on his tablet from the corner of my eye. 1800 hit. 2100 hit, clean hit, center grouping. She paused here, not long, maybe 90 seconds. She was watching the wind indicators. The flags at the intermediate positions were showing a shift. The northwest wind was backing around, which Garza had been tracking. A backing wind at this range means the correction you calculated 3 minutes ago is already out of date. Some shooters make their adjustment quickly and shoot before it changes again. Some wait for a window of steadiness. It's a judgment call that exists somewhere between math and instinct. Alina waited. The flags settled for about 20 seconds into what looked like a brief stabilization. She pressed the trigger in what appeared to be a single fluid motion that didn't involve any visible change in her body at all. The round traveled 2400 meters and hit the plate. Garza was quiet for a moment, then hit center. I heard a sound from somewhere in the group behind me, not quite a word, more like the beginning of a word that didn't quite form. I didn't look to see who made it. The day's session ended at 2400 meters for the group as a whole. It was a respectable result, better than some previous Archer cohorts, Hargrove noted during the afternoon debrief. He was measured about it the way good commanders are measured, genuine in his acknowledgement, careful not to create division between shooters who'd gone further and those who'd stepped back earlier. This wasn't about winners and losers in that moment. It was about data. But data has texture. And the texture of that day's data was that Alina Vasquez had matched or exceeded every other shooter at every distance she'd engaged, and she had done it with a rifle that was visibly, obviously personal, a tool with history, not a program issue platform, and she hadn't said anything about it. Hadn't commented on her performance, hadn't made any visible reaction to any of her hits, had packed up her rifle with the same deliberate care she'd used setting it up and gone to log her own notes. Hargrove found me during the break between the range session and the evening debrief. This was unusual. Our interaction throughout the program had been professional but mostly logistical. He stopped near the equipment bay where I was working on some inventory tracking and looked out at the range for a moment. "What do you think of the group?" he asked. I knew what he was asking, or I thought I did. "Strong cohort," I said, "particularly at the upper distances." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, then Vasquez. "Yeah. Where's she coming from? Her record's clean, but it doesn't show this." I didn't say anything for a moment because I was thinking about how to say what I actually thought, which was, maybe her record doesn't show this because nobody gave her the distance to show it before. But I didn't say that. Instead I said, sometimes records are a floor, not a ceiling. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't entirely classify. Not dismissive, not convinced either, somewhere in between, the expression of someone whose model of the situation is undergoing quiet revision and they're not entirely comfortable with the process. "Tomorrow we push to 27, he said. "Yeah. We'll see." He walked away. I stood there and thought about what "we'll see" means when the person saying it is the one holding the evaluation rubric, and I hoped that what it meant was what it sounded like on the surface. That night there was a kind of unofficial gathering at one end of the mess tent, nothing sanctioned, just people sitting together with coffee at the end of a hard day the way people do. Becker was there, Tran was there, a couple of the range crew. I was there. Elena came in, got coffee, and this time didn't go to the far end alone. She sat down, not quite at the center of the group but not at the edge either, somewhere in the middle geographically and socially. Whitfield made room for her without making a production of it. The conversation was the kind that happens after long days on a range, half technical, half story swapping, the particular currency of people who spend their lives doing precise dangerous things and decompress by talking about precise dangerous things they've done before. Becker was telling a story about a training evolution in Montana wind conditions that had everybody's calculations falling apart, and how his spotter had called a correction that technically shouldn't have worked but did. Elena listened. She smiled once at something Akaffer said. She made a comment about elevation compensation at extreme ranges that was brief and specific and clearly drew from experience, and I noticed the way Becker's attention sharpened when she spoke, the way he recalibrated the way you do when someone says something that sounds like real knowledge. Tran asked her directly where she'd developed her long-range background. Elena was quiet for a moment, held her coffee cup in both hands. Southwest, she said, took some private instruction, did a lot of range time. Private instruction, Tran said, not skeptical, genuinely curious. There's a man in New Mexico, Elena said. Retired, he doesn't advertise, you find out about him by word of mouth. She paused. He had me shoot the same target at 800 meters for 3 weeks before he let me touch anything further. 3 weeks, every day, wind, no wind, morning, evening, the same target. Nobody said anything for a moment. Why? Akiffer asked. He wanted me to know the difference between the bullet going where I aimed and the bullet going where I thought I aimed, she said. He said most shooters never actually learn that difference. They just learn to make adjustments and call them corrections. He wanted me to understand the shot before I started adjusting anything. Becker was looking at her with an expression of genuine respect that had nothing performative in it. And you started shooting with your own rifle, Tran said, not a question, understanding something. He told me that a rifle is a relationship, Elena said. You can borrow someone else's rifle and shoot it well, but you can only really know one rifle. And once you know one rifle, really know it, the way it breathes, the way the barrel heats, the exact feel of the trigger at every temperature, then the distance stops mattering as much, because you've removed one variable completely. The fire crackled, someone poured more coffee. The rifle's not the variable anymore, Whitfield said quietly. Elena looked at him. Yeah, she said, exactly that. I lay awake again that night, which was becoming a pattern, but this time it wasn't anxiety keeping me up. It was something more like anticipation, the feeling you get when you're close to something that hasn't happened yet but is clearly going to happen, and the waiting is its own kind of tension. 2,700 meters tomorrow. That's not a distance that has casual meaning. That's a distance that puts you in a very small category of shooters who have ever attempted serious precision work. At that range, you're no longer fighting physics in the normal sense, you're in a different conversation with physics entirely. The bullet drops more than 20 meters over that distance. The flight time is over 3 seconds, during which the Earth's rotation has actually moved the target a measurable amount. The wind across 2,700 meters is not one wind, it's several winds at different altitudes and different positions along the corridor, and you can only read the ones near you, which means you're partly guessing what's happening in the middle of the flight path and hoping your guess is right. Most professional long-range shooters don't operate at 2,700 meters. The world record for a confirmed sniper kill at the time of Archer 7 was somewhere around 3,500 meters, and the people who held those records were understood to be statistical outliers of outliers, the upper atmosphere of human capability. But I remembered what Elena had said at the fence in the dark. Far enough. I closed my eyes and listened to the wind work its way across the desert, and I thought about what she meant by that, and I thought about the instructor in New Mexico and the same target for 3 weeks, and sometime around 200 I finally slept. Day 4 began with a weather complication. Not dramatic, this wasn't a storm, wasn't anything that would have shut down the range. But the wind had picked up overnight and was running variable, 12 to 18 miles per hour with occasional gusts to 22, shifting direction through nearly a 40-degree arc. The range meteorologist briefed the group at 6:30 with charts and readings and a careful face that said, "This is workable but it's not friendly." Hargrove made the call to push ahead. These were experienced shooters, and variable wind was a real-world condition, not an anomaly to be waited out. If the program only ran in perfect conditions, it wasn't testing what it was supposed to test. The first two shooters in rotation, it had been re-randomized, worked through 2100 and pushed to 24. The wind cost them, not catastrophically but visibly. Groupings opened up. One shooter called himself at 24 when a 5-round string produced 2 misses. He stepped back, honest about it, that was the deal. Becker went third. He managed 24 in the variable conditions with 1 round going slightly wide within acceptable parameters. He pushed to 27. 2 of his 5 rounds missed the plate, not badly, but the wind had pushed them out. He stepped back and stood there with his arms crossed, thinking about something, not upset, calculating. Alina was fourth again. She spent longer than usual on her position setup. I watched her check the wind instruments 3 separate times. She had a small piece of surveyor's tape tied to her rifle's barrel, not standard personal habit, and she was watching the way it moved with a focused attention that reminded me of the way falconers watch their birds. Complete attention, everything else stripped away. The variable wind was doing what variable winds do, coming and going, shifting and settling and shifting again. Alina was watching for patterns within the variability, because there are always patterns. Chaos has structure if you watch it long enough. She waited 4 minutes before she fired her first round at 2700. The round hit the plate. Garza said hit in the same neutral voice he used for everything. She waited through another wind cycle for the second round. 3 minutes, fired. Hit. Third round, 2 minutes of watching, fired. Hit. The group behind me had gone very quiet. Not the loud quiet of drama, the deep quiet of people who have stopped performing any emotion and are just watching. Fourth round, the wind gusted at the moment before she fired, and I thought she might hold off, but she didn't. She'd read something in it, some pattern I couldn't see from my angle. The round went. Hit. Fifth round, she paused longer on this one than any of the others. I didn't check my watch, but it felt like 5 minutes. The flags at the intermediate positions were showing conflicting information, the close flag one direction, the mid-range flag backing, the far flag neutral, 3 different wind stories in the same corridor. She fired. The indicator at 2700 meters flipped over. 5 for 5, 2700 meters, variable wind 12 to 22 miles per hour shifting. Hargrove was very still. I was watching him, and he was very, very still in a way that was different from his normal composed stillness. His tablet was in his hand and he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at the range. Then he was looking at Alina. Then he was looking at the range again. One of the program staff said something to him quietly. He nodded once. He didn't say anything to Alina directly at that moment. The session continued. There were 2 more shooters to go through the rotation, but something had changed in the air on the range. Something had shifted. I could feel it the way you feel a change in barometric pressure, not quite able to articulate it, but certain it's there. Alina packed her rifle with the same deliberate care she always used. She wrote in her notebook. She drank water from a metal bottle she'd been carrying all week. Whitfield came and stood near her for a moment. He said something to her, just a few words, and she looked at him with an expression that was almost a smile but wasn't quite. I found out later what he said. He said 3 more days, whatever you're thinking about, don't stop thinking it. She looked at him and said, I know. That night Hargrove came to find me again. This time he didn't make any pretense about logistics. She's not what I thought she was, he said. I waited. Her scores today were, he stopped, started again. In the program's history, we haven't had that result at 2700 in variable wind, not clean. I nodded. What do you think she can do? He asked. It was a genuine question. He wasn't testing me. He was actually asking, the way people ask when they're recalibrating something important and they want another perspective. I thought about the fence in the dark, far enough. I think, I said carefully, that she knows exactly what she can do, and I think she's been waiting for someone to give her the distance to do it in. Hargrove looked out at the dark range. Tomorrow I'm adding a target position at 3000, he said. I looked at him. I wasn't planning to, he said. It wasn't in the protocol, but I'd be a bad program coordinator if I built a ceiling at 2700 when I might have someone who can go higher. He turned and walked back toward the operations tent. I stood there for a moment, alone in the cooling desert air, feeling something that took me a minute to identify. It was the particular feeling of watching someone do the right thing, the thing that required them to revise their own assumptions and act against what had been a comfortable certainty. It's not a feeling you get all that often. When you do get it, it stays with you. Some mornings you wake up and you know the day is different before anything has happened to prove it. I don't know how to explain that better. It's not superstition and it's not some mystical premonition. It's more like accumulated pressure. The way a week of weather builds towards something. 3 days of Archer 7 had been loading the air with expectation, and on day 4 I came awake at 5:30 with the distinct sense that the weight of what had been building was about to find somewhere to go. The new target at 3,000 meters had been set up overnight. I knew this because I'd been near the operations tent when the range crew went out with their equipment around 2200, moving quietly in the dark with flashlights and a utility vehicle. The target frame was a standard reflective plate, the same kind used at all the other positions, but there was something about watching them carry it out into the darkness that felt different from logistics, felt like preparation. Like setting a stage. 3,000 meters in daylight is not actually that far visually. The target plate would be visible to the naked eye as a small rectangle, a thumbnail at arm's length, but visible and hittable are completely different languages. A bullet at 3,000 meters has been in the air for more than 3.5 seconds. It has fallen more than 22 meters below line of sight. It has crossed 3 or 4 distinct wind environments that the shooter can only partially observe. The mathematics of the calculation alone, ballistic coefficient, muzzle velocity, elevation, temperature, Coriolis correction, occupy a data card that looks like the margin notes of a dissertation. And that's before you account for the things you can't calculate, the microgusts, the density-altitude variations in the lower corridor, the small turbulences created by the ridgeline geography that the meteorologist can model but never perfectly predict. 3,000 meters is where math stops being enough and judgment has to take over, judgment built from 10,000 hours of doing the work. Hargrove announced the protocol change at the morning briefing. He was direct about it. Based on yesterday's performance data, we're adding a target position at 3,000 meters for qualified shooters. Qualification for the extended range phase is clean performance at 2,400. Any shooter who achieved that standard yesterday is eligible. He listed the names: Becker, Tran, Alina. Akheffer had made it to 24 but with a marginal grouping. He was honest about it himself before Hargrove had to be. "I'll hold at 24 today," he said. "That wind yesterday taught me something. I want to apply it before I push further." Nobody argued with that. There's a particular kind of respect that goes to the person who knows their own honest boundary and will name it without being asked. So 3 shooters would attempt 3,000 meters. Becker looked at the announcement with his usual composure and made a small note. Tran nodded once. Alina was looking at the horizon. She wasn't looking at Hargrove or at the range chart he was holding. She was looking at the actual terrain, the actual direction of the light, the way the air was moving this morning in ways only visible to someone who had learned to look for them. The wind conditions were better this morning, steadier than yesterday, running consistently from the northwest at 9 to 11 miles per hour. A known quantity, or as close as weather in the high desert ever gets to that. I've thought about how to describe the 3,000-meter attempts without making them into something they weren't. They were honest, impressive, difficult work. Becker and Tran both made attempts that were worth something and fell short in ways that were honest, not failures of skill, but of the particular combination of conditions and calculation that extreme distance requires. Becker went first. He managed 2 solid hits at 2,700 in the current conditions, then shifted to 3,000. His first round cold bore on the new distance went wide right, not dramatically, maybe 2 feet off the plate on a gusty push through the mid-range corridor. His second round was more accurate, the wind cooperating, hit the plate with a ring I could hear even at my distance. Third round went high. He fired 5 and hit 2, which was respectable, genuinely respectable, but the grouping told a story of a wind environment that kept changing slightly on him. He stepped back, pulled out his notebook, started working through the data. I respect Becker enormously. He processes every shot. Tran went second. She had a different problem. Her first 2 rounds at 2,700 in these conditions confirmed what I'd suspected, which was that yesterday's wind had been teaching her something and she'd absorbed part of the lesson. Her 3,000-meter attempt produced 3 hits from 5 rounds, with the 2 misses going in opposite directions. One pushed right, one pushed left. Different wind in the corridor at different times. She was splitting a variable wind environment almost perfectly down the middle of the plate's center, which meant she was reading the averages correctly, but the extremes were getting her. She stood up from the position and stretched her back and said something to her spotter that I couldn't hear. Her spotter nodded. She made a note. Then Alina sat up. I'm going to try to describe this carefully because I want to be accurate. Alina spent 14 minutes at the position before she fired her first round at 3,000 meters. 14 minutes. In competitive environments, extended prep time can look like hesitation. In this environment with these distances, I'd learned enough to understand it differently. She wasn't hesitating. She was reading. She was watching the flags, watching the trace of heat shimmer near the mid-range corridor, watching the way the dust at the base of the western ridgeline was or wasn't lifting, watching the small anemometer readings, watching her surveyor's tape. She was building a picture. Not of what the wind was doing right this second, but of what it had been doing for the last 14 minutes. The cycle it was in, the pattern within the variability, the moments of relative steadiness and the moments of push. Garza was at the spotting scope. I was behind him, watching his scope's data feed on the small secondary monitor that fed out to the monitoring station. Other members of the group were positioned around the area, Becker with his arms crossed, Whitfield with his hands in his pockets, Ackhafer standing very still with his head slightly tilted the way people tilt their heads when they're listening to something. Hargrove was to my left, about 6 feet away. He had his tablet, but he wasn't looking at it. Alina fired. The time from trigger to target at 3,000 meters is approximately 3.4 seconds at this velocity, the longest 3.4 seconds I've experienced in a professional context, which is saying something. The target indicator dropped. Garza said hit slightly right of center. I heard Hargrove make a sound, not a word, just a sound like something moving through him. Alina adjusted, not dramatically, some small thing on the scope. She looked through it again, waited. The flags ran through 2 cycles. She waited for the third. On the third cycle, at the particular moment she was waiting for, she fired again. Garza hit center. Becker said quietly but distinctly, "There it is." Third round. Alina watched the wind for 7 minutes, 7 actual minutes. I was looking at my watch this time. When she fired, the flag at the mid-range position was in a brief settled moment that lasted about 3 seconds. The round was in the air for 3.4 seconds, but she'd read the coming steadiness and sent it into the leading edge of the window. Garza hit center. Nobody was saying anything at this point. The range had gone into that particular silence I described at the beginning, the silence of the world paying attention. Fourth round, she went through the same process, watching, reading, building the picture in her head of what was happening 2,000 meters in front of her that she couldn't directly observe. It's almost a meditation, long-range shooting at this level. It's almost prayer. You make your best calculation of a reality you can't directly perceive, and you send something into it, and then you wait for the answer. She fired. Garza hit center. 4 from 4, 3,000 meters. Hargrove was completely still. The fifth round is the one I think about most, not because it was technically different from the others. It hit the plate like the others. Garza said what Garza had been saying. It's the one I think about because of what happened after it. After 5 for 5 at 3,000 meters, Alina stayed in her position for a moment. Not long, 10 seconds, maybe 15, then she sat up and she looked downrange and she was quiet. Hargrove walked forward. He walked to where she was and he stood next to her and he looked downrange too at the target 3 kilometers out that she had just shot 5 times in the center. He didn't say anything for a moment. The range was quiet. Then he said, "Sergeant Vasquez." She looked up at him. "What's the furthest you've attempted?" he asked. His voice was completely different from the first morning, not the voice of someone who has already decided what they're seeing, the voice of someone who genuinely wants to know. She thought for a moment. 3,200 and change, she said. Private range in Utah, different rifle. Hargrove was quiet, different results. First attempt, she said, needed more time with the environment. Second day was better. He nodded. He was looking at her with an expression I hadn't seen from him before, the expression of an officer who is revising something significant and is honest enough with himself to let the revision happen. The program doesn't have a target position beyond 3,000, he said. She didn't say anything. I'm going to authorize range crew to set a position at 3,250, he said. Tomorrow morning if conditions allow. She looked at him for a moment. That's your call, sir, she said. Yes, it is, he said. He turned to walk back, stopped, turned back. Sergeant, that rifle of yours, the MRAD. Yes, sir. Has it ever been to 3200? She looked at the rifle, then back at him. No, sir, but I have. That evening was different from the previous evenings. Something had shifted in the group dynamics, not dramatically, not in any way that would have looked notable to an outsider, but the center of gravity had moved. Elena was now at the center of the table rather than the periphery of it, and not because she'd put herself there, because the group had quietly reorganized itself around the person who had demonstrated something worth organizing around. Becker sat directly across from her and asked her about the instructor in New Mexico. Not the way you ask about something you're skeptical of, the way you ask because you want to understand a methodology that produced results you respect. She talked about it more than she had before. The 3 weeks on the single target, yes, but also the other things. The way her instructor had taught her to read wind by watching grass at different distances simultaneously. The way he'd made her shoot in rain, in glare, in crosswind that would have made most instructors cancel the session, not to build toughness but to expand the database in her head of what different conditions produce. The way he'd told her that the shooter who only shoots in good conditions has learned half a skill. He said there's no such thing as bad conditions. She said, there are only conditions you haven't learned to read yet. Tran was nodding. I want his number. He doesn't have a phone, Elena said, completely deadpan. Everyone laughed. I noticed that Elena laughed too, not a big laugh, a small, real one. The kind that means someone actually finds something funny rather than the kind that means they're performing social appropriateness. It was a small thing. It mattered to me for reasons I can't entirely articulate. Okafor asked her what she was going to think about tonight, given what tomorrow would attempt. She considered the question seriously. He'd meant it seriously. The wind, she said. The valley runs slightly different in the early morning than through the day. I want to think through what that pattern has looked like each morning this week and figure out what tomorrow is probably going to give me. And if it gives you something different, he asked. Then I read it fresh, she said, but better to have a baseline than to show up blank. I found Hargrove at the edge of the operations area around 2100 that evening. He was looking at a weather chart on his tablet, but he didn't seem to be seeing it. You know what's interesting, he said without preamble. I waited. I've run 3 cohorts through this program, and I've seen good shooters, genuinely good, some of the best I've encountered, and usually when someone surprises me there's a backstory that explains it. A particular unit, a particular program, some extraordinary circumstance that produced an outlier. He paused. Her backstory is a man in New Mexico who doesn't have a phone, and she practiced by herself for what sounds like years. Not everyone needs a program to develop, I said. No, he said. He was quiet for a moment. I made assumptions this week about what her record would tell me about her ceiling. I was wrong. You authorized 3200, I said. I authorized it because it's the right thing to do, he said. If she can go there, the program should know about it. If she can't, the program should know that too. He looked up from the tablet. But I also authorized it because I was wrong the first morning and I know it, and I'm not going to compound that by capping what she's allowed to attempt. I looked at him. That's a good thing, sir. He made a sound that was approximately a laugh. It's a basic thing, should have been the default. He tucked the tablet under his arm. Get some sleep, tomorrow's going to be long. I did sleep that night, deeply, without the restlessness of the previous nights. Maybe because the anticipation had resolved into something more settled, not certainty, but readiness. The readiness of someone who has accepted that something significant is going to happen and has decided to simply be present for it. At some point before dawn I half woke and lay there in the darkness listening to the desert. The wind was moving through in steady, even pulls, not the variable chop of the previous days but something more consistent, more predictable. A good sign or a misleading one. In the desert it was hard to know which until you were in it. I thought about Elena in her bunk and what she was doing with the hours before dawn. Whether she was sleeping. Whether she was running calculations. Whether she was simply lying there in the dark listening to the same wind I was, building her picture of tomorrow's conditions from the sound of the night air moving across 3 kilometers of open ground. At 3,250 meters the target plate would be invisible to the naked eye. An abstraction, a mathematical destination. She was going to send a round to an abstraction at dawn. and the round was going to go based on everything she knew, everything she'd learned, everything she'd practiced in the years before anyone outside New Mexico had seen what she could do. I lay there thinking about that, about all the practice that nobody saw, all the rounds at the single target, all the weather and the wind and the early mornings, all of it accumulating toward a moment that would matter and that almost hadn't happened because someone looked at a rifle case and smirked. That smirk, I thought about that too. And what was going to happen to it in about 6 hours. Dawn at 5:47. The light came up slow and orange over the eastern ridge, spreading across the desert floor in long shadows that made familiar terrain look like somewhere else entirely. Cold air, absolutely still. The kind of still you only get in the 10 minutes around actual sunrise before the ground starts heating and the convective currents begin. I was up before everyone else, which had become its own kind of ritual by that point. Coffee that was better this morning, someone had made a fresh pot, and it had that 10-minute window of actually being good. I stood outside the mess tent and watched the light change and thought about nothing in particular for a few minutes, which is a luxury I don't give myself often enough. The range crew had been out since 500, and I could see their truck making its way back along the access road. The 3,250-meter target was set. I had asked one of the crew about it the night before, not the technical specifications, but just, what does it look like out there? He'd thought about it and said it looks like nothing from up close, just a plate on a frame. From the firing line, if you know exactly where to look, you can see it, but just barely. Just the shape of a thing at the edge of what the eye can make sense of. That was what Alina was going to try to hit. The briefing at 700 was shorter than usual. Hargrove covered the conditions, wind at 8 to 10 miles per hour northwest, showing very low variability on this morning's readings. Temperature 41 degrees expected to climb through the session. Altitude same, always altitude same out here in the Nevada high country. He covered the target positions, 3,000 meters standard phase protocol, 3,250 as an extended attempt authorized specifically for this session, available to any shooter who completed the 3,000 phase cleanly. Nobody said much. The group had a particular kind of focus this morning that I'd started to think of as the silence of people who understand the magnitude of what's about to be attempted and are being respectful of it. Even the range crew was quieter than usual. Alina looked the same as she looked every morning. Dusty jacket, hair pulled back, rifle case carried in her right hand. She ate breakfast, I watched her do it, a complete breakfast, unhurried, and then went to her position to begin her pre-range preparation. Whatever she did in those morning minutes was private. She didn't discuss it. She just did it with her notebook and her equipment and the unhurried attention she brought to every preparation. The 3,000-meter phase went first, as protocol required. By now the group's performance at 3,000 had a baseline. Becker, working with everything he'd learned from the previous day, improved his result, 4 hits from 5 on a steadier wind, a meaningful improvement that he acknowledged with a single tight nod when Garza announced his group. Tran went clean 5 for 5 at 3,000 on the better conditions, a result that made her close her eyes for exactly 1 second and then open them and start breaking down her position. Clean 3,000 both of them, authorized for the extended attempt. Alina went through 3,000 in 8 minutes, 5 rounds, 5 hits. The efficiency of it was almost unsettling at this point. Not because it was easy, it was never easy, but because she had reduced the uncertainty so thoroughly that what remained looked like something else. Looked like conversation instead of combat. Looked like dialogue between a person and a distance rather than a person fighting a distance. She reloaded, she stayed in her position. Hargrove said, "Vasquez, ready when you are." Becker and Tran both went before Alina at 3,250. This is important to say because I don't want to write this as though nobody else was brave enough to attempt it. They both went. They both worked hard and honestly at a distance that the program had never formally tested. Becker fired 5 rounds and hit the plate twice. 2 hits from 5 at 3,250 meters in open conditions is not nothing. That is genuinely difficult shooting. He stood up afterward and stretched and looked downrange for a long time with an expression that was thinking, not defeat. Tran hit once from 5. Her misses were informative. They tracked in a pattern that told a story about wind behavior in the mid-corridor at this extended range that her spotter photographed on the monitor for later analysis. She was gathering information even while shooting. That was Tran's genius. Nothing she did was wasted. Then Alina. I want to be honest about what I was feeling standing there. Nervous is not quite right. It wasn't the nervousness of wanting something to go well for social or emotional reasons. It was more like the physical state of being a witness to something at the edge of what's possible. That feeling lives in your chest and it's not comfortable. It's alertness so high it tips into something that resembles fear, except fear of what exactly you can't say. Elena set up. Her preparation for the 3,250-meter attempt was different from her preparation at closer distances. Everything was the same, the deliberateness, the checking, the watching, but there was more of it. More time, more cycles of observation. She was watching the entire 3-kilometer-plus corridor with a patience that I think most people couldn't have sustained. Not because most people lack discipline, but because most people can't quiet the urgency in themselves long enough. 14 minutes, then 18, she was still watching. Garza had his scope on the target and was calling wind observations quietly to himself, not to anyone in particular, just narrating what he was seeing in the way good spotters do when they're in the zone. He'd been Alina's assigned spotter for the program, and by now they had developed a shorthand. She'd look at him sometimes and he'd say something like mid-corridor holding or flag 3 backing, and she'd give a small nod and return to her own reading. They were sharing a model of the corridor and continuously updating it. The flags at 800, 1600, and 2400 meters were all showing the same consistent northwest at approximately 9 miles per hour. This was the best wind condition of the week. The corridor was aligned. The variables were as reduced as they were going to get. Elena took a breath, let it go. Took another breath, let that go too. The rifle settled. She fired. 3.7 seconds. That's approximately how long the bullet was in the air between her position and the target at 3,250 meters. I counted. Not exactly, you can't count exactly when your own heartbeat is part of the timing, but approximately. 3.7 seconds, during which the entire group standing behind the firing line became completely, absolutely still. I have been at concert halls when a famous orchestra reached the exact moment that a performance transforms from excellent to transcendent. I have been in operating rooms, as a visitor, not medical, when a procedure that was going well reached the moment of confirmation that it had gone right. I've been in a lot of environments where the collective attention of a group of people converges on a single point and makes the air feel different. This was that. The target indicator at 3,250 meters moved. Garza said, hit. And then he said, dead center. I don't know who made the sound first. It went through the group like something physical, not a cheer exactly, more like the release of held breath multiplied by everyone present. Becker said something sharp and short that was mostly consonants. Whitfield turned to Ockhafer and they looked at each other with expressions that had no performance in them at all, just genuine human astonishment, which is actually one of the rarest emotions to see on a person's face because it requires them to have run out of the ability to pretend they expected something. Tran put both hands on top of her head and looked downrange. Elena was still in her position. She fired again. The group went quiet instantly. 3.7 seconds. Hit, Garza said, slightly left of center, half-inch. She adjusted something, minute of angle change on the scope. I could see the micro-movement of her hand, then stillness again. Third round. Hit center. Fourth round. The wind had shifted very slightly at the close flag, maybe a degree in direction, maybe half a mile per hour change. Everyone saw it. Garza noted it quietly. Elena saw it too. She waited, the flag returned to its previous position. She fired. Hit center. 4 from 4, 3,250 meters. She paused before the fifth. A long pause, not hesitation. I knew the difference now. She was making a decision about something. I didn't know what until later when she told me, and when she told me it made complete sense. She was deciding whether to go for the center or to attempt the edge of the plate, a more difficult target, smaller margin for error, simply to see whether she could. Not because the program required it, not because anyone asked, because she was the kind of person who, when given a measure, wants to understand its exact boundary. She decided on center. Hit center. 5 from 5, 3,250 meters. Hargrove walked forward. He walked to where Elena was and he stood there and he looked at her and she looked at him. She was still on the ground, half risen from her position, the rifle in her hands. He said, Sergeant Vasquez. She said, sir. He said, I owe you an apology. The range was very quiet. Garza had his head down at his scope. Everyone else was listening without trying to appear to be listening. The first morning, Hargrove said, when I questioned your platform, he paused. That was an assumption I hadn't earned. Alina looked at him for a moment with an expression that was complicated in the way real emotions are complicated when they're not being managed for anyone's benefit. "Apology accepted, sir," she said. "For what it's worth, I was used to it." Something moved across Hargrove's face that I think was the specific pain of hearing something accurate and difficult. "That's exactly the problem," he said. She stood up from the position. She was the same height as she'd been all week, same person, same quiet, but something about how she stood in that moment in the desert light with 3 kilometers of air behind her and the target she'd just hit 5 times at the end of it, something about it had changed. Not in her, I think, in the space around her, in how the space recognized what she was. "What's the program record?" she asked him, not aggressive, genuinely asking. Hargrove checked his tablet. Previous extended range record for this program was 2,900 meters set 3 years ago. He paused. "You've exceeded it by 350 meters. She nodded, made a note in her notebook, just a note, the same kind she'd been making all week. "And the confirmed distance?" she asked. Garza called out. "Laser confirms 3,247 meters to the near edge of the plate, 3,251 to center." Alina absorbed this. 3,247, she said quietly, to herself, not to anyone, writing it down. I watched her write it. I thought, that number is going to matter, that number is going somewhere from here. The afternoon session was technically scheduled to continue with other protocol elements, but Hargrove made the call to pause and reconvene. It was the right call. The morning had taken something out of everyone, not in a bad way, more the way that witnessing something extraordinary is itself taxing, because you spend the whole time fully present, and full presence is genuinely exhausting. People spread out across the range area. Some went to eat, some went to debrief with their spotters. Becker came and sat near me at one of the equipment tables, and for a while neither of us said anything. "You know what the weird thing is," Becker said finally. "What?" She didn't look surprised. "I thought about that, no." She looked like she was hoping it would work, focused on it working, but not surprised when it did. "She knew her capability," I said. "She just needed the distance." He was quiet for a moment. "That's what gets me. How many people have that kind of capability and never get the distance?" He looked down at his coffee. "How many people just never get the program, never get the 2700 target, never get the authorization for 32, they top out at whatever the protocol allows and nobody ever finds out?" I didn't have an answer for that. It's not really a question with an answer. It's the kind of question that just lives with you if you're paying attention. "She got it though," I said. "Yeah," he said, "she got it." Late afternoon, I found Alina sitting alone on a low concrete barrier near the far edge of the range area. Not the fence this time, she'd moved further, closer to the range itself, facing toward the target line. The long corridor of desert stretched out in front of her, and 3,000 meters away, at the edge of visibility, was the plate. I walked over and sat near her. The way you do when someone is in a private place and you want to be near them without intruding. After a while she said, "I've been thinking about the instructor he would have liked today." "Why?" "Because he always said the hardest thing isn't the shot. The hardest thing is getting to the shot, doing all the years of work in the absence of any guarantee that anyone is going to give you the distance to use it." She was quiet. "He said most people give up before the distance comes, not because they can't shoot, because they can't tolerate the uncertainty of not knowing if the distance will ever come." "You didn't give up," I said. "I kept showing up," she said. "That's all it was. Every range day, every calibration session, every miserable morning in rain at 800 meters for the 1,000th time, I just kept showing up." She looked at the plate. "And eventually somebody put a target out there." I looked at the plate too, just a rectangle of metal 3 kilometers and change. "An abstraction," the range crew had said. "From up close it's just a plate on a frame. But from here in the afternoon light, it looked like something earned." The last day of Archer 7 was a Thursday. I remember because I had a logistics call scheduled that morning that I had to push back, and when I looked at the calendar notification on my phone, the date caught my eye: Thursday, and the week was almost over, and something about that ordinary fact landed strangely. Thursday, the kind of day that usually means nothing, just a day in the middle of a week, except this Thursday existed on the other side of something, and the side it was on felt different from the side it had been on before. The program's final day was structured for post-range analysis, documentation, and debrief. No live fire, just the work of understanding what the week had produced. Shooters with their spotters going through data. Range staff breaking down the environmental monitoring. Hargrove meeting with each shooter individually to review their performance profiles and discuss program conclusions. I had my own documentation to complete, but I kept finding reasons to be near people instead of paperwork. I think I knew, without consciously admitting it, that this particular collection of people in this particular place was a temporary thing, and the week was the only version of it that was ever going to exist. The morning was warm. The wind had died to almost nothing by 800, which was unusual and made the range feel different, quieter, more exposed somehow, without the constant background sound of air moving across the desert. The mountains to the west were sharper without haze. The sky was the particular deep blue of altitude and low humidity. Becker was at one of the analysis tables with Garza, going through his shot data with the methodical care of an engineer. He had charts. He had elevation profiles. He was building the post-mortem of every round in the program's extended range phase with the kind of thoroughness that would produce actionable information for every future range session he ever attended. I sat near him for a while and watched him work and thought about what Becker was doing and what it meant, the discipline of turning an experience into information, of refusing to let even a missed shot be wasted. Everything gets processed. Everything becomes material. "You going to try 32 again sometime?" I asked. He didn't look up from his chart. "I'm going to get there," he said. It wasn't bravado, it was the flat certainty of a plan. Tran was working with her spotter at the meteorological station, going through the wind analysis from the extended range phase. She'd requested access to the detailed corridor data, the readings from the intermediate monitoring stations, the temperature profiles, the micro variations that the on-ground crew had recorded. She was building a map of the wind environment at each distance. I looked at what she was doing and it was genuinely sophisticated. She was trying to understand not just what the wind had done but why it had done it. The valley geometry, the ridgeline effects, the thermal patterns at different times of day. She was trying to model the environment so that the next time she stood at 3,200 meters, she would walk in with a head start. "You're coming back," I said. She looked up with an expression that said, "Obviously." Alina's debrief with Hargrove happened at 1,000 in the operations tent. I wasn't inside for it, but Hargrove found me afterward and told me something about it, not because I'd asked but because I think he needed to process it with someone. "She's going to apply for the long-range precision instructor program," he said. I looked at him. "Not as a student," he said, "as an instructor candidate." That stopped me for a moment. The long-range precision instructor program was a small, selective track, maybe 15 people in the Army at any given time. The prerequisites were demanding and the selection process was subjective in ways that could disadvantage someone whose record was clean but not decorated. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her I'd write the endorsement myself," he said, "and that if the selection board has questions they should call me directly." I thought about the first morning, the equipment table, the smirk. "You've come a long way from we'll see," I said. He made a sound, not a laugh exactly. "I came a long way from a lot of things this week." He looked at the ground for a moment. "I want to ask you something and I want an honest answer." "Okay." If she'd been different background, different presentation, walked in with commendations and a high-profile unit on her record, would I have questioned the rifle? I thought about this honestly. I don't know, maybe not. "I think not," he said, "which means the issue wasn't the rifle. The issue was what I assumed the rifle represented when I saw who was carrying it." He paused. "That's something I have to think about in terms of how I run programs." I nodded. "She didn't complain," he said. "She didn't say anything about it after the apology, just moved forward." "That's her style," I said. "Yeah," he said, "her style is to just be better than everyone's assumptions, which works. It worked this week, but it shouldn't have to be someone's strategy. They should just get to show up and be evaluated on what they can do." I didn't say anything because he was right and there wasn't anything to add. The afternoon wound down the way final days do: equipment returns, transport arrangements, the slow disassembly of a temporary world. People who had spent a week living within walking distance of each other began the work of becoming separate again. Akaffer was the first to leave around 1400. He shook hands with everyone including Alina, and when he shook her hand he held it for a moment and said something to her that I was too far away to hear. Whatever it was, it made her nod once and look at him steadily and say something back. He nodded and got in his vehicle. Tran left at 1600. She and Alina exchanged information. I saw them both looking at phones, numbers being shared. Tran gave her a look that was part respect and part something more human, some recognition between two people who understand something that others in the room might not. Whitfield left last of the shooters after dark had almost fully settled. He said goodbye to Becker and to me, and then he went to find Alina near the equipment bay, and I watched them talk for a few minutes. He was doing most of the talking. She was listening. At the end she said something brief, and he nodded once hard, the way you nod when someone has said something true and you want to acknowledge it. Later I asked him what she'd said. I told her she was going to change some things, he said. That the record was going to matter, that the program documentation was going to travel, that people were going to know her name. He paused. She said, I don't need them to know my name, I need them to stop assuming they already know what I'm capable of. I thought about that for a long time after he drove away. Becker and I were among the last civilians left on the range as the sun went fully down and the range crew finished their breakdown. We were at the equipment tables drinking bad coffee again. It had gone back to being bad, the good 10-minute window long over, and the comfortable silence of two people who have shared a strange week had settled between us. You know what she did fundamentally, Becker said, not a question. Tell me, I said. She changed the frame. The program was built with a certain ceiling, 2700, theoretically 30, but nobody had seriously tried 30. And the ceiling existed partly because of capability and partly because nobody had come along and forced the question. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. She forced the question. Now the frame has changed. Now 3200 is part of the conversation. Now the next program that runs here, the people running it will think differently about what's possible. They'll push further because she pushed further, and the person after them will push further because of that. She'll be teaching some of those people, I said. If the instructor program accepts her. Hargrove's writing the endorsement. Becker was quiet for a moment. Good, he said, that's good. He drank his coffee. You know what else she changed? What? The answer to the question, what does a shooter like this look like? He set down his cup. Before this week, if you described the top performer in an extended range trial, the picture in someone's head would look a certain way, because that's who had the records, that's who had done it before. He looked out at the range. Now the picture looks like her. I saw Alina for the last time at 21:30 when she was loading her truck. The rifle case went in first, carefully, securely, the way it had come. She checked it was secure, then loaded the rest of her gear. I walked over and she turned when she heard me coming. Heading out, I said. Long drive, she said. Back to San Antonio. For a few days, then there's a range in Wyoming I've been wanting to get to, different elevation, different wind environment. She leaned against the truck. The 3200 shot was in one specific set of conditions. I want to know how it translates to different conditions. I shook my head, not in disbelief but in something close to wonder. You literally just set a program record by 350 meters. Today's conditions, she said. I want to know if it's repeatable in different conditions, that's the question. And if it is. She thought about this, then I'll push the question further. I looked at her in the dark, leaning against her truck in the high desert, calm as a morning with no wind. This woman who had driven in dusty civilian clothes to a proving ground where nobody expected her to matter and had methodically, patiently, without drama or declaration, dismantled every assumption in the room. The instructor in New Mexico, I said, does he know what you can do? She smiled at that, small and real. He's the only one who knew before this week. He must have been something, I said, as a teacher. He told me once, she said, that talent is just the first room. Most people never find the second room. The second room is where you do the work when nobody's watching and nobody cares yet. And the third room is where you do it when people are watching but they're watching you fail. She looked at the rifle case in the back of her truck. And the fourth room, if you make it there, that's where the distance is. I stood there in the dark with that for a moment. How many rooms are there? I asked. She picked up her last bag and put it in the truck. I'll let you know when I find out. She got in the truck. I stepped back. The headlights came on, sweeping briefly across the range before she turned onto the access road, and then the red taillights were moving away through the dark desert, and then they were small, and then they were gone. The range was empty. Quiet the way it had been that first morning before anything had happened yet, before anyone had arrived, and the desert was just itself, distance and silence, and the kind of space that makes you either very small or very real depending on who you are. I stood there for a few minutes and looked at where the lights had gone. 3,247 meters, a number that existed now permanently in the program record, in Garza's spotter log, in Hargrove's report, which he told me he was going to file with a supplemental note about protocol expansion for future cohorts, in the memory of everyone who had been on that range. In the muscle memory of a woman driving west through the Nevada dark toward a range in Wyoming, and then wherever came after that. I thought about the first morning, the equipment table, the smirk that had crossed Hargrove's face when he'd looked at the rifle case, small, quick, already half-formed from assumptions made before she walked through the door. The smirk of someone who thinks they already know what they're looking at. I've seen that smirk 100 times in a dozen different environments. The quick dismissal, the unconscious sorting that happens before the evidence is in, it's not usually malicious. It's usually just the reflex of certainty, the comfort of believing you can categorize what you're seeing. She didn't fight the smirk. She didn't argue with it or call it out or demand to be seen differently before she'd earned it. She just walked to her position and did the work, round after careful round, distance after distance, until the smirk didn't have anything left to hold onto. Until the face behind the smirk looked at a number on a tablet and had to reckon with what it meant. That's the way she chose to do it. Whether it should have to be done that way is a separate question, and an important one, the kind Hargrove was asking himself on the last evening, the kind that doesn't have a clean answer. The world isn't structured so that every person's capability is automatically visible. The structure has to be changed, and changing it requires the work of many people over many years, and that work is real and necessary. But on that particular week in that particular desert, she had chosen her way, and her way had left a number in the record that nobody could take out. 3,247 meters. Small digits, enormous distance. The kind of distance that starts as a question and ends as a fact. I drive out to that desert sometimes, not often, once a year maybe when work takes me back through Nevada. There's no reason to stop there specifically. The range isn't operational except during program sessions, there's nothing to see. But sometimes I pull over on the access road and look out at the valley. And I think about a morning in October when the world held its breath for 3.7 seconds and then exhaled. And somewhere right now, there's a woman on a range somewhere, maybe Wyoming, maybe somewhere else, maybe somewhere nobody has thought to put a target before, lying flat in the wind, watching flags she can barely see at distances other people haven't thought to measure, writing numbers in a small notebook that the world doesn't know yet. Building the fifth room. Waiting for someone to put out the target.